The state-rooms at Buckingham Palace were a choreography of history, gilded cornices, oil portraits that watched without blinking, a carpet so thick it seemed to quiet even the most confident steps. Cameras waited at a careful distance, courtiers hovered like shadows polished into protocol. At the center of it all, King Charles III stood beneath a chandelier's patience, his expression the studied calm of a man who has inherited centuries. Opposite him, Ibrahim Traoré carried no entourage larger than necessity, just a lean security detail and the kind of steadiness that doesn't ask the room for permission. Pleasantries passed like envelopes, unsealed, unread, filed by the moment. Then the king's tone, still soft, found a firmer bone. "The crown," he said, "still has influence." The words were not a threat. They were a weather report, offered from a nation that once decided climates for others. Traoré's answer came as a half-smile, neither insolent nor deferential. "Not over us," he said. The syllables fell without echo, as if the room itself absorbed them out of respect. A courtier's quill paused mid-note. A camera's red light blinked on. Silence in palaces is not empty, it is curated. In that curated pause, the distance between empire and independence became something you could point to, a precise measurement drawn between two men who understood that history is a currency, and someone was changing it. The king inclined his head, the gesture at once courteous and inquisitive. "Independence," he replied, "is a discipline more than a declaration. We've watched nations find it, then lose it to the winds of finance, famine, or fanatics." Traoré did not look away. "Then perhaps you saw them asked to prove freedom on ledgers they didn't write," he said. "We'll draft our own pages." Outside, rain combed London in patient lines. Inside, time slowed. A portrait of a long-dead monarch seemed to lean closer, listening. This meeting was meant to be symbolic, handshakes, headlines, heritage photographed from the right angle. But symbols can split, and meanings can turn. Somewhere beyond the velvet rope, a correspondent typed 2 lines that would become a lower third graphic by nightfall: "The crown versus the continent. Who commands the future?" Here, under light older than most countries, a young president and an old institution discovered that influence is not a relic to be displayed, it is a claim to be tested. The words lingered like the aftertaste of strong tea, subtle, but impossible to ignore. A court photographer, unsure whether to capture the moment, lowered his lens. The protocol officer shifted her weight. The king's eyes held steady on Traoré, but there was something sharper now, a flicker beneath the formality. "You speak of drafting your own pages," Charles said, voice dipped in the kind of patience that has watched empires swell and shrink. "But even the freest of nations must write them on paper supplied by others." Traoré's brow didn't furrow. Instead, his smile deepened into something that wasn't amusement but a refusal to concede ground. "And yet," he replied, "paper can be made from our own trees." It was not just an answer, it was a quiet defiance dressed in simplicity. The king's lips tightened ever so slightly, the kind of reaction court etiquette teaches one to hide but never fully erase. The palace's grand clock chimed, each note a reminder that time was being spent on something more than ceremonial exchange. Outside, the rain had eased, but the grey London sky pressed against the windows like an audience leaning in. Charles took a step closer, enough for the cameras to read intent in proximity. "Influence," he said softly, "is not always visible. Sometimes it is a hand unseen, shaping choices before they reach the table." Traoré's gaze didn't waver. "Then perhaps you will find," he said, "that some tables are no longer set by the crown." A hush spread, not of discomfort but of recognition, that this was no longer a diplomatic courtesy call. It was a duel without swords, fought with lines sharpened by centuries on one side and resolve forged in a much younger fire on the other. The aides began exchanging glances, sensing that the conversation was drifting into waters deeper than the itinerary had prepared for. Headlines were already forming in their minds, not about partnerships or goodwill, but about the tectonic shift when a continent's voice refused to echo the empire's. If history was a conversation, this room had just added a new paragraph, one that would not be erased easily. The table between them, polished to a mirror's truth, reflected two very different legacies, one steeped in centuries of inherited rule, the other born of a revolution barely a year old. The contrast wasn't just political, it was generational, cultural, almost elemental. Charles leaned back slightly, as if to study Traoré the way one might examine a rare artifact, curious, but also cautious not to misread its value. "You speak with certainty," the king began, "but certainty has broken many leaders. History has a way of humbling those who forget the forces that shape it." Traoré's answer came with the steadiness of a man who had already weighed such words against his own resolve. "And history has a way of erasing the names of those who believed their forces would last forever." It was the kind of exchange that didn't need volume to carry power. The aides shifted uneasily, the air seemed thicker, as if the palace itself was reluctant to inhale. Charles's voice lowered, almost conversational. "You know the crown's reach is not measured only in borders. Influence is threads, woven quietly, but strong enough to pull a nation back when it drifts too far." Traoré rested his hands on the table, fingers interlaced, posture unshaken. "And yet," he said, "the more we cut those threads, the freer our movement becomes." From somewhere beyond the chamber, a faint murmur of tourists echoed through the palace halls, footsteps and whispers oblivious to the fact that a diplomatic line was being drawn in real time. The king's gaze lingered, as though calculating whether to press further or retreat to safer terrain. But Traoré's composure made retreat feel like concession, and concession was not a language spoken here. For now, both men chose silence, not as an end, but as a pause, the kind that lets the weight of words settle before the next strike. The pause was long enough for the room to breathe again. A servant entered quietly, placing a silver tray with tea between them, the clink of porcelain sounding almost ceremonial. Both men reached for their cups, but their eyes never broke contact. Charles stirred his tea with deliberate slowness. "There is a difference," he said, "between cutting ties and burning bridges. A wise leader knows when one becomes the other." Traoré sipped before answering. "Sometimes the bridge was never built for us to cross, it was built to bring you in." His tone was calm, but the implication landed like a stone in still water, sending invisible ripples through the space. A courtier shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the exchange. Yet no one interrupted. This was the kind of conversation that lived beyond minutes and memos. Charles placed his cup down with precision. "The crown," he continued, "has outlasted those who thought themselves beyond its reach. Influence adapts, it doesn't fade." Traoré leaned forward slightly. "Then perhaps this is the moment history learns that the reach has limits." Outside, the palace gardens lay untouched by the storm of words inside. The rain had stopped, but the clouds lingered, as if unsure whether to release the sun or keep the day cloaked in gray. In that moment, it wasn't about who would win the exchange, it was about who would define it. Every phrase was a brick, every silence the mortar, building a narrative that could stand far beyond this meeting. Somewhere, a journalist was already drafting an article, "The day Buckingham heard, not over us." The room seemed smaller now, as if the gravity of their exchange had pulled the walls closer. The portraits of past monarchs looked on, their painted eyes accustomed to moments of quiet rebellion but perhaps not to hearing it spoken so plainly. Charles's voice carried a faint steel edge beneath its royal polish. "You speak as if influence is a chain. For many, it is a lifeline. We have offered stability where chaos would have consumed." Traoré met the statement without hesitation. A lifeline can also be a leash. Stability offered at the price of freedom is not stability, it is control dressed in softer words. A pause followed, thick enough to hold the weight of empires. An aide from the king's staff glanced at his notes, as though hoping the next item on the agenda would appear and rescue the moment. But this was not a meeting to be rescued, it was one to be remembered. Charles shifted slightly in his seat, breaking the stillness. "You underestimate how fragile independence can be. One drought, one debt crisis, and the winds change. The crown knows how to weather those storms. Traoré's eyes narrowed just enough to signal his resolve. Then you should know, he replied, that storms also wash away what no longer belongs on the land. Somewhere in the palace, a clock struck the half-hour, each chime a reminder that time, like influence, was finite. Outside, the clouds finally began to break, sending thin shafts of sunlight through the high windows. The light fell between them, a symbolic divide no less real for being accidental. The air was charged now, not with hostility, but with the rare electricity that comes when two powers meet knowing neither will bow. Both had come expecting ceremony, both had found a contest. The sunlight, fractured by the tall windows, painted long lines across the polished floor. Each beam seemed to divide the space into territories, light and shadow, past and present. Charles leaned slightly forward now, his voice taking on the quiet intensity of a man accustomed to being listened to. "You see the crown as history's hand on your shoulder," he said. "But that hand has guided more than it has restrained. Without it, some would have fallen long before they could stand." Traoré's reply was measured, but each word carried the weight of granite. "And some have been kept kneeling because the hand never let them rise." The exchange landed heavier than before. This was no longer a polite disagreement, it was the clash of two definitions of leadership. Around them, the ornate gold leaf and ancient tapestry seemed almost out of place, as if the room itself had slipped into a different century. The king's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "You believe freedom is permanent," once claimed. "But the world will test you, its markets, its politics, its enemies." Traoré didn't blink. "Freedom is not permanent. That is why we defend it ourselves, not lease it from those who once took it." The air between them was taut now, the kind that could snap with one ill-chosen phrase. Courtiers shifted in their positions, suddenly aware that this conversation would leave the room long before they did. Through the window, the sun broke fully from the clouds, flooding the chamber in light. It seemed almost symbolic, an intrusion neither side could control, yet both could feel. The king glanced briefly at the brightness, then back at Traoré. "Perhaps," he said, "we are both learning where influence ends." "Perhaps," Traoré answered, "we are both learning where it never began." The words hung in the air, heavier than the ornate chandeliers above them. One of the king's senior advisers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the gilded clock as if time could dissolve the tension. But this was not the sort of conversation that faded, it was the kind that etched itself into the walls. Charles adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, the movement small but deliberate, as though reclaiming a measure of composure. "You speak as if the past is a prison," he said, his voice smooth but carrying an undercurrent. "Yet many who criticize it still drink from the wells it built." Traoré's response came without pause. "Some wells were dug to give water. Others were dug to keep people from leaving. We know the difference now." That single line shifted the energy in the room. The courtiers knew they were witnessing something that would not be reduced to a press release. This was a test of wills disguised as dialogue. The king leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing. "And what will you do when those wells run dry?" Traoré's answer was quiet, but each syllable felt like a stake driven into the ground. "We will dig our own. And they will be deep enough that no one can poison them." Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window panes, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. Inside, the silence that followed was not one of peace, but of mutual acknowledgement. Neither man would concede the moral ground he stood on. It was in this stillness that the realization struck both sides: this was not simply about Britain and Burkina Faso, about monarch and president. It was about the enduring struggle between influence imposed and independence claimed. And in that realization, the conversation was no longer just theirs, it belonged to history. The king's fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, a rhythm too controlled to be impatience but too deliberate to be idle. His gaze drifted briefly to the rain-speckled window before returning to Traoré. "You speak of building anew," Charles said, "but the world is a web. You cannot simply cut the strands you dislike without feeling the pull from the rest. Traoré's voice was calm, the kind that draws more power from its steadiness than from volume. We don't want to cut every strand. We only cut the ones that bind our hands while pretending to lift us. An advisor in the corner scribbled something in a leather-bound notebook. Whether it was a record of the exchange or a warning for future briefings, no one could tell. The silence after Traoré's words was filled not with awkwardness but with thought, the kind that makes a man measure his next sentence carefully. Charles leaned forward, clasping his hands. And if those strands also hold the weight of protection? Influence is not always an enemy. Traoré's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Nor is it always a friend. The clock ticked loudly now, as if counting down to a point neither man wanted to reach but both knew was inevitable. This wasn't about ending the conversation, it was about deciding who would hold the last word. From the gardens, the sound of footsteps on wet gravel filtered through the glass. Somewhere outside, life moved on, indifferent to the centuries of history pressing against the walls inside. The king studied Traoré for a moment longer, then gave a slow nod, not agreement, but acknowledgement. In that nod was a rare admission: influence could meet its match in conviction. The meeting had not ended, but something in it had shifted. The chamber seemed quieter now, though the silence was deceptive. Both men were still calculating, measuring, testing the edges of what could be said. This was no longer a formal audience, it had become a contest of endurance. Charles spoke first, his tone low but steady. You understand, President Traoré, that refusing the crown's guidance comes with consequences. We do not impose them, but the world reacts to absence. Influence vacuums are quickly filled. Traoré met the gaze without flinching. And perhaps that is the point. Let the vacuum form, and we will fill it ourselves. For too long, others have decided what flows into our space. Now, we decide. The king's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in recognition. He had heard this kind of conviction before, from revolutionaries, reformers, even rivals. But hearing it in the palace, from a leader who had no intention of bending, was another matter entirely. A shaft of sunlight cut through the room again, this time landing directly across the table between them. It seemed almost staged, a physical reminder of the divide neither man intended to cross. Charles leaned back, exhaling slowly. The world will watch, and it will test you. Every drought, every currency drop, every border dispute will be a question: can you stand without leaning? Traoré's reply came like the closing of a door. We will not just stand, we will walk. And we will walk where we choose, not where your maps lead. The advisors exchanged brief, uneasy glances. There was no hostility in the room, but there was no reconciliation either. This was diplomacy's sharpest form, not a handshake, but a line drawn in the brightest light possible. What happened next would not be decided here, but both men knew this meeting would echo far beyond its walls. The final moments of the meeting unfolded like the last moves of a chess match, each player aware that no more bold advances could be made without risking everything. The king rested his hands on the arms of his chair, posture unshaken, eyes fixed on Traoré with the weight of centuries behind them. You will find, Charles said, that history is not so easily rewritten. Its ink stains deeper than you think. Traoré leaned forward, his voice steady and low, each word measured. History's ink only stains if we let it. We carry our own pen now. The words seemed to close the distance between them without either man moving. There was no raised voice, no theatrical gesture, just an undeniable certainty hanging in the air. Outside, the clouds had fully broken, and sunlight poured into the chamber, illuminating the floor like a stage. It was a light neither could claim, yet it bathed them both equally, a silent reminder that the world beyond their walls would judge their actions, not their titles. The king gave a slow, deliberate nod. Then may your pen be worthy of the page you seek to write. Traoré returned the nod. And may yours finally tell the whole story. For a brief moment, the tension eased, not because agreement had been reached, but because both understood the other would not bend. This was not defeat, it was recognition. Two leaders, two worlds, and a single truth: influence ends where resolve begins. As Traoré left the chamber, the echo of his footsteps lingered longer than they should have. In their place, a question remained, one that neither the crown nor its critics could answer yet: when the future arrives, whose story will it tell? When we sat in this chamber, it was not just two leaders speaking, it was two visions for the future colliding. I do not deny the history you represent, nor the power it has carried through centuries. But power is not eternal, it must be renewed through the consent and trust of those it touches. We in Africa are not seeking to erase history, but to write the chapters that belong to us. We do not reject cooperation, but we reject control disguised as guidance. The crown may still have influence in parts of the world, but over us? No. Our future will not be shaped by maps drawn in foreign halls, but by the hands of our own people. Influence fades. Resolve does not. And today, I stand here to say, Burkina Faso walks its own path, and we walk it without fear.